Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a brutal, transformative 150-year period, a series of conflicts that didn't just change borders but completely reshaped Europe's soul. It's a story of how a world defined by faith became one forged by statecraft and raw power. For over 1,000 years, Europe was held together by a single, powerful idea. But then the Protestant Reformation came along, and it didn't just challenge the church, oh no. It ripped the very fabric of that identity apart, plunging the entire continent into a century and a half of absolutely devastating war. Before all this chaos, the idea of Christendom was everything. It was the foundation of society. The lines between your faith and your allegiance to your king they were blurry, because both were seen as part of this single divine plan. That was all about to change. Forever. Okay, so let's start with our first case study, 16th century France. Now, France was a deeply Catholic country, but a really powerful Protestant minority, the Huguenots, started to gain a lot of traction, especially with the nobility. And this, right here, set the stage for an absolutely spectacular clash with the monarchy. And look, this conflict wasn't some abstract theological debate. It was personal, and it was unbelievably brutal. The powerful Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, she saw these influential Huguenot nobles as a direct threat to her family's grip on the crown. Then things just exploded in 1562 at Vassy, and a decade later, the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants were just butchered in the streets of Paris. This turned a political rivalry into a bloody, unforgettable religious war. All of this chaos eventually spiraled into a power struggle so messy, they literally called it the War of the Three Henrys. So you had Henry III, the sitting king, you had Henry of Guise, a Catholic extremist trying to steal the throne, and then you had Henry of Navarre, the Protestant heir just waiting to inherit the whole thing. It was basically a three-way royal rumble for the soul of France. And then, in a wild turn of events, both of his rivals get assassinated. Suddenly, the Protestant Henry of Navarre is the last man standing. He's now King Henry IV of France. But how do you rule a deeply Catholic country as a Protestant? Well, he made an absolutely stunning, pragmatic choice, and it's all captured in this one legendary quote. He converted. That's the crucial point. He chose the stability of his kingdom, the unity of his people over his own personal religious beliefs. And in doing so, he became the ultimate example of a totally new kind of leader that was emerging, the polique, a ruler who believed that the interests of the state came before anything else. All right, now let's flip the coin. In total contrast to France's new pragmatism, we have the unbending, ironclad faith of the Habsburg dynasty, the incredibly powerful rulers of both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Spain's King Philip II had a very simple mission in life: defend Catholic orthodoxy everywhere. He was fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, and he was absolutely determined to stamp out Protestantism wherever it popped up, especially in his own massive territories. But here's the thing, Philip's rigid, faith-first approach, it backfired, big time. His brutal persecution of Dutch Calvinists didn't crush them. It actually drove them to declare independence, creating a brand new Protestant republic. And then when he sent his legendary Spanish Armada to invade England, it was famously destroyed. This shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility and pretty much secured Protestantism's future in the north. So these conflicts we've seen in France and the Netherlands, they were really just the opening acts. They were the prelude to the main event, a devastating continent-wide war that started out about religion but ended up as something completely different. It was kicked off by a Protestant rebellion in the Holy Roman Empire, but the 30 Years' War would become one of the longest, most destructive conflicts in all of European history. For 3 decades, it dragged in almost every major power, completely blurring the line between fighting for God and fighting for national glory. Okay, now this chart is fascinating because it perfectly maps out how the war evolved. You can see it starts as a purely religious fight in Bohemia. Then it gets a little mixed. But just look at those last 2 phases. The motivation shifts decisively from religious to political. And you might notice one country playing a very surprising role here. And this is it. This is the ultimate example of what this whole explainer is about. The chief minister of Catholic France, a cardinal no less, starts funding the Protestant Swedes. And eventually he sends French troops to fight with the Protestants.
Why on earth would he do that? Simple. To weaken his Catholic Habsburg rivals. The war wasn't about saving souls anymore. It was purely about state power.
So, after 30 exhausting years of a war that killed millions of people, the great powers of Europe finally came to the negotiating table. The treaties they signed, known as the Peace of Westphalia, wouldn't just end the fighting, they would literally define the modern world. The Peace of Westphalia was just a massive shift in thinking. It brought the era of major religious wars to a close, and it officially threw out that old idea of a unified Christendom. In its place was a brand new principle: state sovereignty. Basically, the ruler of a territory was now the boss of that territory, period. The Pope and the Emperor no longer had the final say.
I mean, just look at this comparison. It shows you how huge that shift was. The old world, this ideal of a unified Christendom guided by religious unity, it was gone. It was replaced by a system of independent, sovereign states, each one competing for its own power and influence. The world of the politique had won.
So over 150 years, Europe went from being a continent tearing itself apart over which version of God was right, to a continent of competing nations fighting for power, for land, and for influence. The very reason for going to war had fundamentally completely changed.
And that's the real takeaway here. This new system, born from the ashes of religious war, leaves us with a profound question that honestly, we are still grappling with today. In this modern world that these conflicts created, what is the role of faith in the machinery of the state?